There was a quiet strangeness to the hours before dawn at RAF Bentley Priory, a cold tranquility settling over the grounds as if the world itself hesitated before inhaling. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding often found those moments the most honest, when the darkness did not seek to conceal anything, but instead revealed a truth beneath its stillness, and he stood alone at his window, watching a thin ribbon of frost claim the grass. It was in this silence that he felt the weight of expectations pressing upon him, not expectations of greatness, but of blame, should failure arrive clothed in smoke and falling metal. The truth, unspoken by the officials who circled Whitehall like restless tides, was that Dowding was not meant to triumph. He was meant to endure, to delay, to absorb the consequences of underfunded squadrons and clipped budgets, of the polite skepticism of politicians who believed a modern war would surely follow the pattern of the last. Even Churchill, formidable and lion-hearted though he was, did not foresee the magnitude of what this quiet, severe Scotsman would carve into the spine of history. Dowding knew the walls of command were never built to protect the solitary man who stood at their centre, and he felt the coldness of that truth as viscerally as the morning frost now seeping into his bones. He did not crave heroism nor the loud applause of public gratitude. He sought only the fragile thread of survival for the island he loved, a thread woven from young pilots who still smelled faintly of youth and from the steel-hulled machines that roared in defiance against a sky filling with threat. If Churchill underestimated him, it was not out of malice, but out of the chaos of a nation scrambling to stand upright before the storm broke. The Prime Minister did not expect miracles from him because he could not have imagined the scale of the inferno that was coming, nor that Dowding had already positioned himself to be the quiet architect of England's endurance. At Bentley Priory, the hum of the operations room never ceased. It felt like the heartbeat of a wounded animal, steady yet fragile, its rhythm set by women with headphones pressing close to their temples, by officers bent over tables marked with chalk and grease pencils, by the constant low murmur of distant aerodromes requesting updates. Dowding descended the stairs slowly each morning into that half-lit world, absorbing its tension and its purpose, aware that he carried their fears in addition to his own. He believed that the nation's salvation lay not in grand speeches nor impulsive offensives, but in the cold precision of preparation. Every map, every radar echo, every quiet report mattered, weaving a tapestry of intention that only he seemed willing to defend against the skeptics who called him stubborn, difficult, uncooperative. They did not see that his resolve was born of necessity rather than ego. The days blurred into one another as diplomatic pressures swelled like hidden tides, and Dowding sensed that the political world regarded him as an obstruction, a rigid figure clinging too tightly to his methods. Yet these methods would become the backbone of resistance. He had spent years crafting a system of defense so intricate and yet so deceptively simple that others dismissed it as overly cautious. Now, as the clouds over Europe thickened with menace, he prayed that those same critics would never understand the cost of their doubt. He walked the operations room floor slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his face set in that reserved expression that so many mistook for aloofness. But inside him burned a fierce, unwavering devotion to the pilots who soared into combat, with barely a heartbeat's warning, young men whose letters home were sometimes written with trembling fingers before sunrise, knowing they might not live to see the sunset. When he visited the airfields, he noticed the thinness of their resources, the patched tarmac, the exhausted ground crews working with the devotion of saints. He felt the unspoken fear among commanding officers who tried to hide the fact that squadrons were being stretched beyond breaking point. Yet he asked for little, demanded almost nothing, because he knew the nation had little left to give. He watched the flight lines where Spitfires and Hurricanes stood like faithful hounds poised to leap, and he felt a sorrow so deep it carved hollows beneath his ribs. He wondered how many more he would see crumble into ruins under enemy fire. How many more young men would be sealed into silence by the cockpit glass that moments earlier had reflected the fire of their determination? And yet, as he looked upon them, something resolute stirred within him. It was not hope. Hope was too delicate a thing, but a quiet certainty that the impossible might still be grasped if one simply refused to let go. The weight of political indifference was heavy, but heavier still was the knowledge that the island's fate hung on decisions that only he was prepared to make. In those moments, Dowding understood that while Churchill rallied the spirit of the nation with thunderous words, it would fall to him to turn those words into survival. What Churchill never expected Dowding to achieve without political support was not victory, but endurance, the sheer, stubborn persistence to keep the island breathing through the smoke and terror of a war it was unprepared to fight. The first weeks of the aerial campaign unfolded with the slow inevitability of a gathering storm, the kind that builds on the horizon without haste, its darkening mass pressing against the sky like a warning. Dowding sensed its approach not from any single report, but from the accumulation of countless small details, the subtle shifts in enemy patterns, the quiet tension in the voices of his controllers, the steady increase in loss tallies whispered through the operations room long after the corridors had emptied for the night. Each morning he sat in his office, reviewing the previous day's figures with a calmness that was almost misleading, for beneath that still surface grew an exhaustion so profound it resembled a physical ache, a bruise deep within his chest that refused to fade. He found himself studying the faces of the young pilots sent into the skies again and again, their eyes ringed with sleeplessness, yet lit with an unwavering resolve that unsettled him, because he knew such resolve could be shattered in an instant by the relentless machinery of war. He walked among them during his visits to the stations, feeling the dry crunch of gravel under his boots, nodding at the salutes they offered, noting how many of them carried the weight of recent losses in the stiff set of their shoulders. They still joked among themselves, still tried to cloak their fear beneath bravado, but Dowding saw the tremor beneath their words, the silent understanding that none of them could rely on tomorrow. The truth pressed heavily upon him that no political speech, no cabinet reassurance, no newspaper headline would ever convey the immediacy of what these boys faced. And yet it was precisely these boys who bore the consequence of every delayed decision at Whitehall. He was not blind to the growing frustration among the politicians who saw him as overly cautious, too reluctant to deploy squadrons abroad, too unwilling to gamble. They mistook prudence for timidity, failing to grasp that Dowding's calculations were not born from fear, but from a deep, almost prophetic understanding that the real battle had not yet begun. He refused to dispense men and machines into the maw of continental disaster, for he knew that when England's hour of isolation arrived, the skies above the Channel would become the final measure of the nation's survival. He accepted the quiet contempt this earned him, the murmurs that circulated through the corridors of power suggesting he was obstructive, narrow-minded, incapable of adapting. None of them understood that he had seen a shape in the future that they refused to acknowledge. There were days when the pressure folded around him like armor growing too tight, when the exhaustion of constantly defending his decisions left him feeling as though the very air had thickened. Yet he carried on with the unyielding discipline of a man who had long ago accepted that leadership was not meant to be comfortable. The weight of command pressed into him with a relentless constancy, a reminder that he alone had been entrusted with the rhythm of the nation's defense. He spent hours in the operations room, standing motionless as waves of reports washed over him, hearing the clipped updates of radar stations, the terse confirmation of interceptions, the silent dread that filled the gaps between each transmission. Even then he felt the quiet presence of sacrifice lingering like an unseen shadow, knowing with a pang that every plotted course across the table below represented a life suspended between hope and annihilation. During those tense afternoons when the roar of engines overhead seemed unending, Dowding would often retreat for a moment to the narrow window at the side of the priory, watching the small black dots weaving high above the tree line. It was here that he confronted the full magnitude of what Churchill had never imagined he could achieve: the ability to hold the line with almost nothing. The radar network he had championed, the system of coordinated defense he had stitched together through years of opposition, the resolute pilots who trusted him more than the ministers did, all of it combined into a fragile yet astonishing resistance. He marveled at the contradiction that one could feel both immense pride and immense sorrow at the same time, for every successful interception meant another young life thrown into the fire, another gamble with odds no mortal could control. As the weeks passed and the Luftwaffe intensified its pressure, Dowding felt the unspoken question rising like a tide in the hearts of those under his command. How long could they withstand this onslaught? The answer hovered unspoken between them, a truth too delicate to articulate. They would endure as long as they must, because the alternative was unthinkable. The nation's breath depended on the thinnest margin of resistance, a margin Dowding protected with the stubbornness of a man who could not afford to falter. He had become the quiet sentinel of the skies, not through charisma, but through unwavering conviction. And though history would one day cast his actions in bronze, he moved through the present with the gravity of one who feared each decision might fracture the fragile shield he had built. And yet, despite the bitterness and the losses, he found a strange kind of strength in the unity of those around him. Controllers, plotters, pilots, engineers, they formed a single, living organism whose arteries pulsed with courage. Dowding did not lead them through force of personality, but by offering a stillness that anchored their resolve. It was this stillness, calm in the face of chaos, that Churchill had underestimated, never dreaming that such quiet determination could hold back the edge of catastrophe without the full armour of political support. But Dowding understood that greatness often grows in silence, nurtured by those who refuse to bend even when the world leans hard against them. As the night settled once more over Bentley Priory, he stood alone in the operations room, its maps glowing under dim lights, and he felt the strange, haunting certainty that the darkest days were still ahead. Yet he knew too that the spirit of resistance he had cultivated was stronger than any doubt cast upon him. The storm was gathering, and they would meet it together, with whatever strength remained. It was not enough, but it was everything they had. If you're enjoying this unfolding story, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. The summer deepened into a heat that felt strangely at odds with the cold precision of war, as if nature itself refused to acknowledge the widening shadow spilling across Europe. The days grew longer, their light stretching across the fields and runways with a golden softness that clashed violently with the brutal machinery rising in darker skies. Dowding often watched the contrast with a kind of quiet grief, sensing that beauty had become an unwitting bystander to suffering. Each sunrise seemed to mock the coming devastation, its gentle warmth failing to soften the blow of the losses that arrived like clockwork. The sun rose magnificently over an island holding its breath, and beneath that splendor, Dowding felt the withering of something fragile within him, as though each new day carved away another sliver of his strength. The Luftwaffe's assault intensified in waves, each more crushing than the last, and the rhythm of the battle began to imprint itself on every soul at Bentley Priory. Morning raids, midday pressure, evening harassment. The cycle repeated with a relentless regularity that bordered on inhuman. Reports arrived like cold stones dropped into Dowding's hands, detailing destroyed hangars, severed airfields, pilots lost in fields of flame, civilians buried beneath the ruins of their own homes. He absorbed it all with a stillness that others mistook for detachment, unaware that behind the calm, his mind churned with a storm of calculations, fears and griefs he never dared voice. To show the depth of his emotion would be to allow the structure around him to crack, and he had long accepted that leadership demanded the sealing of one's own wounds. He would walk through the operations room with the slow, deliberate steps of a man carrying invisible armor, pausing by the plotting table to watch the wooden markers shift like pieces in a sinister, living puzzle. The hum of voices, the clatter of phones, the steady, urgent commands of squadron leaders, all of it blended into a symphony of controlled panic. Dowding listened with the intensity of someone trying to decipher meaning from chaos, aware that every decision carved new paths between life and death. The radar stations fed their warnings into the room like distant, echoing heartbeats, and he marveled quietly at the intricate system he had fought so hard to protect from bureaucratic meddling. It was both fragile and remarkable, a web of human intuition and mechanical precision that held the weight of the nation upon its trembling threads. During brief respites between attacks, he sometimes stepped outside, feeling the sun on his face for only a few seconds before the next wave of reports pulled him back indoors. He watched mechanics covered in sweat and oil laboring over aircraft that had barely cooled from their previous sorties, their hands moving with a desperation that transcended fatigue. He saw pilots lingering by their machines, gazing upward as if searching for meaning in the empty blue expanse. Some closed their eyes, mouthing silent prayers. Others stared into the distance with the hollow look of men who had seen too much in too little time. When Dowding approached them, they straightened instinctively, offering respectful nods, but he could sense the weight of questions they carried. Questions about survival, about trust, about the wisdom of the orders that sent them repeatedly into the storm. He answered none of them aloud. Words, he believed, could not fill the void created by fear. Instead, he offered them what little he could, the steady, unwavering composure of a man who believed in them utterly. The politicians might doubt him, critics might whisper that he lacked aggressiveness, but the pilots sensed something truer in his presence, a quiet assurance that he would not waste their lives needlessly. This bond, formed without ceremony, gave him a strength he did not fully understand. It fortified him during sleepless nights when the weight of casualties pressed upon his chest like a stone, and every decision replayed itself in his mind with agonizing clarity. As the enemy turned its focus to the airfields themselves, the pressure deepened into something almost suffocating. The ground seemed to vibrate with each distant explosion, and smoke rose in thick black plumes that curled into the sky like sinister fingers. Dowding received the reports in chunks of harsh, clipped sentences from commanders whose voices trembled despite their discipline. Tangmere shattered, Kenley bombed, Manston pounded into broken earth. He marked the damage with the cold practicality of a surgeon, but felt each blow internally as a fracture. Every airfield lost meant greater strain on those remaining, greater pressure on pilots fighting not merely for victory, but for the very ability to take off at all. He felt the creeping dread that the system he had built, the delicate orchestration of radar and fighter command, might buckle under the weight of such relentless assault. Yet even as doubt whispered at the edges of his mind, there was a deeper, harder resolve beneath it, a conviction that the enemy's onslaught could not simply overpower the will of a nation determined to survive. It astonished him that this conviction remained so steady, for nothing about the situation suggested hope. But hope, he realized, was not born from favorable odds, but from unyielding devotion. He had pledged himself to defend the skies long before the storm arrived, and now the storm would have to crush him before he abandoned that vow. Churchill, for all his brilliance, had never imagined that such steadfastness could flourish without political nourishment. He had underestimated the quiet defiance that Dowding carried like a second heart beating beneath his ribs. Dowding did not need applause or approval. He required only the chance to do the work that mattered. And as the flames rose higher across the southern coast, that work became ever more desperate, ever more sacred. He stood at the center of it, like a solitary pillar refusing to crumble, despite the tremors beneath his feet. In the late evenings when exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision, he would retire to his quarters only to lie awake, hearing phantom engines droning in his mind, imagining the pilots still battling miles above the sea. He wondered how many more would fall before morning, how many families would open telegrams bearing the final words no parent wished to read. Yet he also sensed a strange, growing defiance within the nation, a collective tightening of the spine, as if every loss carved deeper into the island's resolve. The battle had entered a phase of merciless intensity, but something within Dowding refused to yield. Not to despair, not to pressure, not even to the looming threat of removal whispered by those in the political elite who found his quiet strength unnerving. He would endure, because endurance was the only weapon left to him, and perhaps the most powerful of all. The shift from desperation to outright siege came not with a single moment of revelation, but through a steady accumulation of pressure that tightened around fighter command, like an iron clasp. By late August, the Luftwaffe's intent had become unmistakable, its aircraft sweeping across the channel in widening formations that darkened the morning sky like flocks of metallic carrion birds. Every day seemed heavier than the last, each sunrise carrying the weight of a nation clinging by its fingertips to the thin, trembling thread of resistance that Dowding had woven so carefully. The air grew thick with tension, and the very atmosphere of Bentley Priory felt charged, as though every breath drawn by those within its walls tasted faintly of smoke and fear. Dowding moved through that charged environment with a gravity that seemed to anchor everyone around him. He felt as though the world had narrowed into a corridor of decisions, each more critical than the last, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation. When he entered the operations room, the staff straightened almost imperceptibly, their weariness momentarily held at bay by the simple constancy of his presence. They had come to recognize the measured calm in his voice, the way he absorbed information without flinching, the way he seemed to hold the entire weight of the battle within him, yet continued to stand without ever showing signs of collapse. It was not bravado, but something older, something forged from discipline and a profound sense of duty. But within that calm lived a tangle of fears he could never share. He feared the moment the system would finally break, when losses would outpace replacements, and the fragile defense he had constructed would tear open under the strain. He feared that the politicians circling Whitehall, hungry for someone to blame, would intervene in ways that would unravel years of preparation. And silently, he feared that the world would never understand the cost borne by the young men he sent into the skies, men he thought of with a tenderness he rarely allowed to surface. They were the lifeblood of the defense, the beating heart that kept the island alive, and he knew that each of them lived suspended over an abyss that grew wider every passing hour. The enemy's focus shifted with ruthless precision from airfields to the very core of Fighter Command's infrastructure. Radar stations became priority targets, their skeletal masts standing vulnerable against the vastness of the sky. Dowding listened to reports of their destruction with a cold, controlled fury, knowing that every demolished tower tore another hole in the shield he had spent years trying to perfect. The radar crews rebuilt what they could with bare hands, soldering wires in the wind, hammering platforms at dawn, their dedication nothing short of miraculous. Dowding regarded them as unsung heroes, invisible to the public, yet indispensable to the survival of the nation. He knew that Churchill, for all his understanding of grand strategy, could never have predicted the sheer depth of Dowding's reliance on these quiet guardians of the electromagnetic horizon. Inside the Priory, the air grew heavier with each new wave of attacks. Controllers traced enemy formations with fingers that trembled only when their owners believed no one was watching. The plotting table became a battlefield of shifting lines and markers, its surface scarred by the constant pressure of updates. Dowding studied it like a priest reading an ancient sacred text, interpreting the patterns that danced across it in ways no one else could quite match. He had spent so long refining the system that it felt like an extension of his own mind, a vast and intricate web of signals and instincts guiding him through the storm. Pilots arrived at their stations with faces smeared in oil and exhaustion, yet whenever Dowding visited, he found them greeting him with a politeness that bordered on reverence. He responded with a gentle, understated warmth that few expected from a man of his stern reputation. He would place a hand on a young pilot's shoulder, offer a quiet nod, or simply stand with them for a moment as they watched the empty runway stretching before them. In those brief encounters, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. The pilots trusted him not because he promised victory, but because he never lied to them about the cost. Losses mounted in a relentless tally, and Dowding found himself memorizing names he wished he could forget. He kept their faces in a private corner of his mind, a catalogue of vanished youth that haunted him during the silent minutes before dawn. Some nights he stood by his window, watching the faint glow of fires burning miles away, feeling as though the world was fraying at the edges. The sense of looming collapse pressed against him like a physical weight. Yet he remained outwardly composed, because he knew that if he ever allowed the facade to crack, the entire structure beneath him might crumble. The pressure from the political sphere intensified, just as the enemy's assault reached its peak. Critics accused him of reluctance, of caution bordering on cowardice, failing to understand that his measured approach was the only thing preventing total collapse. They scrutinized his every decision with cold detachment, unaware that each order he issued cost him something irreplaceable. Some ministers whispered of replacing him, believing that a more aggressive commander might turn the tide. They failed to grasp that aggression without reason would only feed the flames consuming the nation's youth. Churchill, though publicly supportive, struggled to reconcile Dowding's quiet resilience with his own vision of martial heroism. He could not have foreseen that the man he once doubted would hold together the defense of the realm through sheer force of will. For Dowding did not fight with rhetoric or political leverage, but with a stubborn, almost monastic devotion to survival. His was the strength of a man who refused to abandon hope, even as the sky seemed to crack open above him. And still the battle intensified, the thunder of engines echoing across the southern counties like a constant storm. Every day felt like the edge of the breaking point, every night a fragile reprieve. Yet Dowding continued to stand, unwavering, the silent sentinel at the helm of a nation's defense, guiding its final line of survival with hands that trembled only in solitude. Through the smoke and fire, through the weight of doubt and the relentless scrutiny of those who understood nothing of the burden he carried, he endured. And in that endurance lay the first flicker of the miracle no one, least of all Churchill, had expected. The possibility that an island so fragile, so vulnerable, might yet withstand the full fury of the storm. September arrived not with relief, but with a deepening sense of inevitability, as though the air itself had thickened under the immense weight of the enemy's ambition. The Luftwaffe, frustrated yet far from deterred, shifted its strategy with the cold deliberation of a predator adjusting its angle of attack. What had begun as targeted assaults on airfields and radar stations now broadened into something more indiscriminate, more brutal, and Dowding felt the shift like a tremor running through his bones. The battle was no longer merely military. It was a contest of endurance between a nation's spirit and the relentless will of an adversary determined to crush it. He watched the transformation with a somber clarity, understanding that this moment would define the very soul of the island. The first night of intensified bombing struck London with a ferocity that startled even the most hardened commanders. Flames rose in towering pillars, illuminating the sky with a molten glow visible even from the distant windows of Bentley Priory. Dowding stood at his narrow pane of glass, watching the horizon pulse like a wounded heart, knowing that beneath those infernal lights lay homes, families, histories now torn open by fire. The sound travelled faintly across the darkness, a deep, distant roar that seemed to stretch from earth to heaven. It was the sound of a civilization under assault, and Dowding felt the gravity of it press heavily into his shoulders. He had prepared for the defense of airfields and machinery, for the safeguarding of radar lines and fighter squadrons, but nothing could quite brace the soul for the sight of a city burning. Inside the Priory, the operations room shifted subtly in its atmosphere. The staff worked with the same precision, the same discipline, but their expressions carried a new tension, a silent question lingering in the air. If the cities burned, what meaning did their defensive lines hold? Dowding answered this unspoken fear not with speeches, but through the unshakable steadiness of his presence. He reminded them quietly, through every measured gesture, that their work mattered more now than ever, for if the nation was to withstand such devastation, it would need the fragile shield of fighter command to remain intact. It would need the pilots to rise again, day after day, into skies filled with enemies determined to extinguish the last flickers of British resistance. The enemy believed that breaking the cities would break the people, but the effect was almost paradoxical. The sight of London aflame did not weaken Dowding. It awakened something within him that had long been coiled in silence, a fierce, unyielding resolve that burned as hot as the fires across the horizon. He realized then that the battle had moved beyond tactics and into the realm of survival, not merely of territory, but of identity, memory, and the stubborn endurance that had always defined the island. Even Churchill had not envisioned the depth of grit required to withstand such sustained terror, nor the crucial role Dowding would play in holding together the psychological fabric of a nation beneath bombardment. As the city suffered, the pilots flew with a ferocity born of grief. Many had grown up walking the streets now burning behind them. They recognized the landmarks beneath the smoke, the winding rivers and domes now shrouded in dust. Their hearts were tethered to the ground even as their lives remained suspended in the sky. Dowding felt their anguish like a distant echo in his chest, a resonance that made his decisions more painful and yet more resolute. He knew that every scramble order sent them back into the storm with diminishing reserves of strength, and he marveled at how they continued to obey without hesitation. Youth had given them bodies of steel and wills of fire, but war had carved into them something deeper, a loyalty that surpassed fear. On the ground, civilians gathered in shelters carved from earth and concrete, their faces lit by candles and the tremulous glow of lanterns. A different kind of courage thrived there, quieter and less acknowledged, yet vital. Dowding imagined them as he reviewed the night's reports. The elderly woman clutching a rosary in the dim light. The mother whispering stories to distract her child from the trembling walls. The young man staring upward through a crack in the shelter roof, seeing flashes of orange that told him his neighborhood might not exist by morning. These nameless souls were the true heartbeat of the battle, and Dowding carried them silently in every calculation he made. In the operations room, the markings on the plotting table became heavier, thicker, reflecting the scale of the nocturnal onslaught. Controllers worked through the night, their voices hoarse, their eyes burning from fatigue. Dowding remained with them through these darkest hours, refusing to retreat to his quarters, while the nation endured its trial by fire. There was something almost ritualistic in his presence, an anchor holding the room together. Even when he said nothing, the staff felt steadier, knowing he was there, absorbing the chaos without flinching. The political pressure, meanwhile, grew more complex. Churchill admired the public's resilience, but frustration simmered beneath the government's surface. Ministers questioned whether Fighter Command was doing enough, whether Dowding's defensive strategy was merely prolonging the inevitable. Some whispered that more aggressive tactics might break the enemy's momentum, blind to the fact that such recklessness would shatter the protection the nation depended upon. Dowding felt this pressure gathering behind him like a tide, yet he stood firm. He knew that surrendering to political impulse would be far more disastrous than any enemy bomb. As the nights of fire rolled one into the next, a strange transformation took place within him. The fear that had haunted him earlier began to crystallize into something sharper, an unwavering clarity of purpose. He understood now that his role extended beyond the coordination of squadrons and the preservation of infrastructure. He had become, almost unintentionally, the guardian of national endurance, the quiet sentinel, ensuring the spirit of the island did not buckle beneath the weight of destruction. And as dawn broke after another night of bombardment, its pale light revealing smoke curling upward from the wounded city, Dowding felt an almost paradoxical calm. The fires still smouldered, the enemy still gathered, the political knives still glinted in the shadows, but Fighter Command stood. The pilots lived to fight another day, and the island, battered but unbroken, breathed still. It was not victory, but it was survival, and in that fragile survival lay the seeds of a defiance neither enemy nor politician had ever expected him to sustain alone. October approached with the hesitant gentleness of early autumn, its pale sunlight filtering through thinning leaves, as though unsure whether it belonged in a world so recently consumed by fire. The air grew cooler, laden with the faint scent of damp earth and smouldering memories, and for the first time in many weeks, the skies above Britain held long stretches of quiet. It was an unfamiliar silence, delicate and trembling, the kind that made even the wind seem cautious. Dowding felt it before he fully trusted it. He sensed the absence of the enemy's roar, not as victory, but as a strange, hollow pause, a breath drawn by fate before it revealed its next intention. Within Bentley Priory, the atmosphere changed in subtle ways. The plotting table grew less frantic, its wooden markers fewer, its lines less frantic and overlapping. Controllers moved with a different rhythm, no longer racing against the constant flood of threats, but adjusting to the unsteady calm that followed. Some dared to breathe more deeply, others permitted themselves brief smiles that carried both relief and disbelief. Dowding, however, remained composed, refusing to let hope rush in too quickly. He had seen too much, felt too deeply the sharp edge of every loss, to surrender to optimism without caution. Yet even he could not deny that something had shifted. The storm had not vanished, but its most violent tempests had finally spent themselves. He walked through the operations room with the slow, measured grace of a man moving through the aftermath of a great upheaval. The staff watched him with quiet admiration, sensing the depth of fatigue etched into his features, but also the unbroken strength that continued to hold him upright. His uniform, once crisp, now bore the creases of many sleepless nights. His eyes, though steady, carried the shadows of hundreds of names and faces that would never return. He bore these ghosts with the dignity of someone who understood that remembrance was not a burden, but a duty. As the days stretched into a calmer rhythm, Dowding found himself reflecting on the improbable path they had walked. Fighter Command had been expected to endure, but not to prevail. The nation had been expected to resist, but not to withstand. And he himself had been expected to serve, but not to succeed. The weight of political doubts, the scarcity of resources, the relentless pressure of those who misunderstood the very heart of the battle, all these had stood against him as firmly as any enemy formation. Yet through stubborn resolve and quiet conviction, he had shaped an outcome that few had thought possible. He looked upon his pilots with a profound mixture of pride and sorrow. Those who survived carried a new gravity in their expressions. The fragile stillness of men who had stood at the threshold of oblivion and stepped back only by a miracle of endurance. Their youth had not returned to them. It had been burned away in the crucible of the skies, replaced by a solemn wisdom they had never sought. Ground crews, controllers, engineers, radar operators, all of them bore the marks of the struggle, their faces lined with fatigue yet illuminated by a quiet, enduring triumph. Dowding saw in them the true measure of victory, a victory not of conquest, but of survival. The politicians, now eager to claim the moment, shifted their tone with predictable ease. Doubts became praise, criticisms softened into commendations, and the whispers of replacement melted into declarations of gratitude. But Dowding received these belated tributes with a calm that bordered on indifference. He had never fought for acknowledgement. He had fought for the sky above the island, for the homes still standing, for the children who would grow up free under a roof of peace rather than rubble. The fact that history would remember him mattered far less than the fact that the nation still breathed. And yet, as the battle's fiercest days settled into memory, Dowding felt a loneliness bloom quietly within him. The burden he had carried, so heavy, so consuming, began at last to loosen, leaving behind a strange emptiness where vigilance had once lived. He stood in the fading light of the operations room for one final moment, the maps before him still bearing the scars of months of fear and courage. He touched the worn edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips, and allowed himself the smallest release of breath, a sigh that seemed to echo across the vast silence that now stretched above Britain. He knew the battle had not ended entirely. War still raged beyond the Channel, and the future remained uncertain. But something fundamental had been preserved. The island had endured, Fighter Command had endured, and the quiet, steadfast determination that guided them through the storm had prevailed against all expectation. Churchill had never expected Dowding to achieve so much with so little support, to hold together the fragile shield of Britain through the worst tempests of its darkest hour. But Dowding had done it not through force of personality or political power, but through his unwavering belief in the worth of the people he led and the nation he served. As he stepped away from the dim glow of the operations room, the first chill of evening touched his face, and he lifted his gaze to the sky, calmer now, gentler, vast and open once more. For the first time in many months, he allowed himself to feel not dread, but quiet gratitude. The sky had been kept free, and because of that, the future remained possible.